Okay, let's unpack this. What if I told you that the highly disciplined student sitting at a desk studying English grammar rules for 5 hours a day is actually rewiring their brain to fail?
Wow. Yeah, I mean, that sounds completely counterintuitive, doesn't it? Because we are so conditioned to treat language learning like a math problem.
Right, like it's just a puzzle you have to solve.
Exactly. You think, if we just memorize enough formulas and rules, we will eventually be able to speak. But the research we are diving into today flips that entirely.
It really does. It suggests that language acquisition is not an academic exercise at all. It's actually a biological adaptation.
Yes. We are looking at how the brain fundamentally prefers to absorb information. And, well, it turns out to be a much more organic, context-driven process.
So our mission today in this deep dive is to deconstruct this really comprehensive guide on modern language learning. We want to extract the exact neurological mechanisms that lead to real fluency.
And for you, listening right now, this deep dive is going to dismantle those old-school myths. The myths about endless rote memorization.
Oh, definitely. We want to show you how to leverage the way your brain actually operates. But before we get into the specific tactics, we need to redefine the goal itself.
Right, because the source makes a pretty aggressive claim about what fluency actually is.
It does. It establishes a very clear baseline. And that baseline is that fluency has absolutely nothing to do with grammatical perfection.
Thank goodness for that. Because knowing the mechanics of the past perfect continuous tense does not make you fluent.
Exactly. Fluency is defined simply as the ability to understand and communicate naturally. It is about cognitive comfort.
I love that phrase, cognitive comfort. I mean, if you can express your thoughts and understand the response without a massive delay in your head, you are fluent, even if you make a few structural mistakes along the way.
I really love that working definition because, it strips away all that academic pressure.
It does. It makes it so much more approachable.
But it also begs the question, if staring at grammar tables isn't the answer, what is the actual formula for getting comfortable?
Well, this brings us to the source's most heavily emphasized principle. It is the battle between intensity and consistency.
Yes, the golden rule of this whole methodology.
Right. The rule is this. Consistency is more important than intensity. Let me say that again slowly. Consistency is more important than intensity.
That is so crucial to remember because the source highlights a very common trap that highly motivated learners fall into.
Oh, the Sunday cram session.
Exactly. People will block out an entire Sunday, study vocabulary and grammar for 5 hours straight, and, they feel incredibly productive.
But the mental exhaustion is just so high, they get so tired that they don't even look at the material again for a whole week.
Yeah, and the data shows this approach actively hinders long-term retention. I'll look at this exactly like physical exercise.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Yeah, because cramming for 5 hours is like walking into a gym once a month and doing a massive, brutal workout.
Right, you just end up totally exhausted.
Exactly. You tear the muscle fibers down, you feel sore, and you burn yourself out. You don't actually get stronger.
But lifting moderate weights for 30 minutes every single day, that creates the micro tears and allows for the recovery time needed to actually build the muscle.
And taking that gym analogy further, just like muscle fibers need rest to grow, neural pathways in the brain rely on something called spaced repetition.
Spaced repetition. That just means practicing a little bit at a time over many days.
Right, because when you study for 5 hours and then stop, your brain's forgetting curve drops sharply. The connections weaken.
But when you engage with the language for just 30 minutes daily, you are constantly signaling to your brain that this information is important.
You're physically thickening the pathways in your brain, which speeds up how fast you can think. And the source suggests highly practical ways to get this daily 30 minutes.
Like listening to English audio while doing chores, or maybe watching a simple YouTube video every morning.
But let me push back on that specific example for a second. Let's say I'm cleaning the kitchen and I put on an English podcast.
Okay.
If I am an absolute beginner and I only understand maybe 1 out of every 20 words, aren't I just swimming in background noise?
That is a very common fear.
Right. I mean, if there's no comprehension, how does the brain actually latch on to anything? It feels like trying to learn by sleeping with a textbook under your pillow.
What's fascinating here is how the brain processes auditory information before it ever attaches meaning to it.
Oh, interesting. So it's working even if we don't realize it.
Exactly. The brain is, at its core, a pattern recognition machine. Long before you understand the definition of a word, Your brain is mapping the sounds of the language.
Like the actual physical sound.
Right. It's analyzing the rhythm, the cadence, the frequency of certain sounds. Even if it feels like background noise to your conscious mind, your subconscious is gathering data on where words start and stop.
So it's absorbing the music of the language before it learns the lyrics.
Precisely. This mirrors the mechanics of how children acquire their first language. A toddler doesn't study sentence structure.
No, they definitely do.
They are simply immersed in an environment where they hear words repeatedly, and those words are tied to specific situations, physical actions, and emotional tones.
And the brain naturally puts all those clues together over time.
It does. It just needs that consistent exposure.
Okay, so if we establish that 30 minutes of daily exposure is better than a 5-hour cram session, that still leaves 23 and a half hours of the day where your brain is thinking in your native language.
Right, the default settings.
Yeah. How do we prevent the brain from resetting to its default settings in that downtime? That is where the source introduces the concept of total immersion.
But it's not the traditional definition of immersion. The traditional advice is usually, move to London or New York.
Which is pretty unrealistic for most people.
Exactly. The source argues that immersion is an environmental shift, not a geographic one, and it breaks down into passive and active immersion.
Let's explain passive immersion first. It's about altering the default text of your daily life.
Right. The prime example the text uses is changing your phone and computer operating systems to English.
I found the psychology behind the phone trick incredibly smart because it relies on cognitive friction.
Cognitive friction, that just means making your brain work a little bit harder in a good way, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Think about it. You look at your phone hundreds of times a day. You already possess the spatial memory of where everything is.
You know exactly where the settings icon is, or the send button.
Right. So by changing the language to English, you aren't memorizing a flashcard. You're mapping a new English word directly onto a deeply ingrained physical habit.
Your brain bypasses the translation phase entirely because the context of the button tells you what the word means.
That spatial mapping is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. You are forcing the brain to learn through context rather than rote memorization.
And then the source pairs that with active immersion.
Which could be things like turning on English subtitles while watching TV, playing video games in English, or reading beginner-level stories.
Yes, reading is heavily emphasized, not for the sake of reading classic literature, but because it exposes you to grammatical structures in their natural habitat.
You start to feel how sentences are built without ever looking at a rule book.
Yeah.
And here's where it gets really interesting for me.
Oh, about vocabulary.
Yes. The source pivots from this broad immersion strategy and delivers a very specific warning about how we acquire vocabulary. It basically tells the reader to completely abandon the traditional flashcard method.
You mean memorizing isolated translations?
Exactly, learning single words one by one.
This is arguably one of the most critical paradigm shifts in the material. The standard approach is to learn that the English word restaurant equals the word in your native language.
But relying on isolated words creates a massive bottleneck when you actually try to speak.
Because of cognitive load, right.
Yes. If you learn isolated words, then when you're sitting in a restaurant and want to ask for the menu, your brain has to scramble.
It has to find the word for could, then figure out the pronoun I, then conjugate the verb see.
And then string it all together in real time. It's just way too much processing power required for a simple 5-second interaction.
That's the exact bottleneck. The source argues that learners should absorb complete expressions. Linguists call these chunks.
Chunks. Meaning a group of words that naturally go together.
Exactly. So instead of learning the word menu, you absorb the entire phrase. Let's practice full sentences to improve the rhythm of speech.
I love that idea. Practicing full sentences helps so much.
It really does. It encourages learners to repeat travel phrases out loud. For example, instead of just menu, the chunk is, could I see the menu?
Could I see the menu?
Yes. Actually, if you are listening right now, we encourage you to repeat this travel phrase out loud. Ready? Could I see the menu?
Could I see the menu? Or another good one is, can we get the check?
Right. Native speakers don't invent new grammar structures from scratch every time they open their mouths. They rely on thousands of pre-built, automated chunks of language.
It's essentially treating a full sentence like a single vocabulary word. When you learn I need to, or I'm going to, as a complete block, you bypass all that grammatical processing.
You just pull the whole tool out of your mental toolbox, ready to use.
And tying it back to your earlier point about cognitive load, Learning in chunks attaches the language to a specific situational memory.
which lowers the processing delay, making your speech much faster and incredibly natural.
Okay, so reading, listening, and learning chunks are fantastic for absorbing the data. But eventually you have to transition from a passive consumer to an active communicator.
You have to actually open your mouth and speak.
Right. And I'm looking at this section on speaking, and it seems like a massive leap. If I'm just passively absorbing TV shows, my jaw muscles aren't learning how to form the actual sounds.
That is a very valid point.
How does the source expect us to bridge the gap from hearing natural English to actually speaking it comfortably?
The mechanism the source introduces to bridge that exact gap is a technique called shadowing.
Shadowing.
Yes. Shadowing is the process of listening to native audio and repeating it out loud almost simultaneously, usually just a fraction of a second behind the speaker.
But the key here is that it goes far beyond just reciting the words, right?
Oh, absolutely. The goal is to imitate the entire vocal performance.
I love the idea of treating it like a performance. It's like learning to sing by belting out a song along with the radio in your car.
That is a perfect analogy.
You're mimicking the artist's exact breath, their tone, their emotional inflection. You're feeling the physical vibration of the rhythm in your chest and throat.
That engages your physical muscle memory in a way that silently reading sheet music never could.
And the physical muscle memory is crucial because your mouth is accustomed to the specific physical movements required by your native language.
Shadowing forces your articulatory muscles, your tongue, your lips, your jaw, to adapt to new, unfamiliar gymnastics. And it specifically trains you for something the source calls connected speech.
Connected speech, that's when words blend together.
Right, because native speakers don't talk like robots reading a script.
Exactly the opposite. If you look at the phonetic examples provided in the text, native speakers rarely enunciate perfectly.
They really don't. They don't clearly separate the words, I am going to eat. In natural connected speech, that phrase morphs into, I'm gonna.
I'm gonna eat.
Exactly. It becomes a single fluid sound, I'm gonna call you. Let's say that together slowly. I'm gonna call you.
Notice how smooth that feels. The source also highlights the word natural. A beginner reading that word will try to pronounce every single letter, natural.
But in real connected speech, the middle syllable softens entirely. It sounds more like nakrul.
Not cruel. That softening is a perfect example.
Shadowing teaches your ear to stop listening for isolated textbook words and start listening for those melodic contours. It trains you to expect nakrul instead of natural.
But let me play devil's advocate here for a second.
Go for it.
Doesn't this hyper-focus on mimicry, trying to perfectly replicate the breath and tone of a native speaker, create a perfectionist complex?
That is a common concern, yes.
I can see someone becoming completely terrified of opening their mouth in public because they're afraid of sounding foolish if they don't sound exactly like the guy on the podcast.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of the source's philosophy, that anxiety is addressed head-on.
Oh, good. What does it say?
The material is very explicit. Perfect pronunciation is absolutely not necessary for communication.
That is a huge relief.
Shadowing is a training exercise. It's the practice field, not the final game.
Yeah.
You shadow to train your ear to understand fast, connected speech and to get your mouth comfortable with the mechanics.
So it's about building the internal hardware, not guaranteeing a flawless external output.
Precisely. When you are actually engaged in a conversation with another human being, the objective shifts entirely. Confidence and flow become infinitely more important than perfect phonetics.
That makes total sense.
Even highly advanced, highly fluent, non-native speakers retain their accents and continue refining their pronunciation for decades. The goal is clarity, not native perfection. You don't need a flawless accent to be deeply understood.
You just need to be willing to engage.
Yeah.
But overcoming that fear of speaking imperfectly requires a massive shift in how we process our own thoughts.
It really does.
We have to eliminate what I call the mental middleman.
The mental middleman, that is the perfect term for the ultimate barrier to fluency. Real-time mental translation.
It is incredibly exhausting. Think about it. If someone asks you a question in English and you have to translate the question into your native language, well, wait, then you formulate your response in your native language.
Then you translate that response back into English.
And then finally speak. The computational lag is just immense. The conversation moves on without you.
It really does.
So what does this all mean? How does the source recommend we actually stop doing this?
The directive is straightforward, but requires intense discipline. You have to start forcing yourself to think in English.
That sounds overwhelming for a beginner.
It does, but the source is very smart about how to implement this. It doesn't suggest you start by trying to debate complex economics in your head in English.
Oh,
You start by narrating your fundamental sensory experiences.
keep it grounded in the physical reality of your day.
Exactly. When you wake up, instead of allowing your brain to form the thought in your native language, you consciously wire the sensory feeling of exhaustion to the English phrase, I'm tired.
I'm tired.
Yes. When it's noon and your stomach growls, you actively think, I'm
I'm
hungry.
hungry.
Right. If you look out the window and see rain, you think, it's raining today. By linking the English phrase directly to the sensory input, you are bypassing the translation circuitry entirely.
And the text points out another major catalyst for breaking that translation habit: enjoyment.
Enjoyment is huge.
We touched on how anxiety blocks learning. But the inverse is also true. Finding genuine enjoyment in the process is one of the biggest hacks to fluency.
It's the secret ingredient.
If you are playing a video game you're obsessed with, or listening to a podcast about a hobby you love, you naturally extend your exposure time.
You aren't studying English anymore. You're just living your life, and English happens to be the medium.
The data strongly supports that learners who intertwine English with their actual passions progress exponentially faster.
They engage with the language willingly, which keeps the brain relaxed and open to learning.
So, what do we say to the listener who is sitting there thinking, okay, I'm immersing myself, I'm shadowing, I'm trying to think in English, but I still feel stuck?
The dreaded plateau.
Yeah, I'm not progressing fast enough. How do they reconcile the daily effort with that feeling of hitting a wall?
This raises an important question about the biological reality of learning. The source offers a very grounding reassurance here. Language acquisition is incredibly gradual.
It takes time.
It is the slow, microscopic process of building connections in the brain. You are building a complex neurological network drop by drop. The tragedy is that many learners quit right in the middle of a plateau, believing the method isn't working.
When in reality, their brain is just busy consolidating all that data under the surface.
Exactly. You cannot wait until your English feels perfect before you grant yourself permission to speak.
If you wait for perfection, you will remain silent forever.
You will. The mandate is to speak early, embrace the messy, imperfect process of communication, and trust the biology of consistent exposure.
Well said.
Yeah.
Let's synthesize the mechanics we've deconstructed today for our listeners.
Sounds good.
First, ditch the brutal 5-hour grammar cram sessions that leave you exhausted. Opt instead for 30 minutes of daily consistency to leverage spaced repetition.
Embrace passive immersion by changing your digital environments to English. Use cognitive friction to map new words to old habits.
Shadow native speakers.
Huh.
Not to become a perfect mimic, but to train your jaw muscles and your ears for the realities of connected speech.
Learn in contextual chunks to bypass cognitive overload. Practice those full travel phrases out loud.
And most importantly, remove the mental middleman by linking simple daily thoughts directly to English.
And as we wrap up today, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. A thought that builds on the underlying science we've discussed today.
Let's hear it.
We've just spent this time exploring how incredibly flexible our brains are, how perfectly they wire themselves to adapt to the linguistic environments and rhythms we surround ourselves with.
Our neurology literally mirrors our environment.
It really does. So if our brains are that highly sensitive to the words and structures we expose them to, well, what other environments, like the media we passively consume, the attitudes we constantly listen to, or the people we spend the most time with, are silently rewriting our brain's default pathways every single day?